Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Weekly Point with Z. Now, in this week's episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion of Russia of Ukraine. And I wanted to mention why this conflict was unavoidable. So it might have come as a surprise for many, but in reality, it was unavoidable. It was years in the making, and as always, it has its roots in the history of the region and the events that played out in the last, I would say, 60 to 70 years at least. Now, before I start, I just wanted to mention as a caveat that I'm a strong supporter of all of the peoples of the world to self-determination. So by nature, I am a strong supporter of Ukraine's right and the Ukrainian people's right to self-determination and to deciding where they want to align themselves. It's no one's business where the Ukrainian people see themselves fit and where they want to align or what they want to align themselves to. It surely isn't Russia's business to decide. But again, the situation is rarely clear as black and white. It's always in the gray, and there are reasons behind the actions of Russia that would be important to mention for us to understand why this conflict originated and where it's heading to. Now, to start, the situation in Ukraine is a situation generated by the divergence of many conflicting interests by many different parties that are involved in the conflict. On one hand, you got the collapse of the Soviet Union, the precedent to modern-day Russia. You got the collapse of the Soviet Union. You got NATO's fear of the Soviet Union reforming at some point in the future. You got this fear of the Soviet bloc reasserting itself and the resurgence of Soviet power, which would destabilize the New World Order, whereby NATO is the victor and the US is the world leader and the only sole superpower. And there was this interest in observing Russia and in keeping an eye on Russia as it rebuilds itself to kind of limit its influence on the world theater, whereby it's denied the opportunity to kind of reassert itself as a global superpower. And to give the US credit and NATO credit, this was done with other nations that participated in the war as well. There was this agreement to kind of limit the power of Germany and limit the power of Japan. And there were these agreements to kind of manage the direction in which these different countries go into to kind of avoid a repeat of World War II and World War I for that matter. So what happened is, in summary, NATO kept on trying to contain Russia and figure out ways to limit its growth, or at least have some leverage to limit its ascension as a world superpower. Now, let's park that for a minute. Let's call that our baseline of understanding and move to other points of view. At the same time, Russia exited the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was under the impression that since it's no longer a threat to NATO, that NATO would no longer be a threat to it as well, and that it had a right to grow and prosper in a certain direction, and that it had a free hand in doing so, knowing that it's, A, the largest country in the world, B, the most powerful nation within the Soviet Union. And Russia never ceased to view itself as a world superpower. The Russian people are very proud. The Russian leadership is very proud. They always saw themselves as a rival to the other dominant superpower, which is the US. And they believed that they had a right to kind of reassert their influence on the world stage. So what they did is they tried to play by the rules. Upon the fall of the Soviet Union, they turned into a free market capitalist kind of system. It was mostly dominated by oligarchies, and the economy was monopolized by these oligarchies close to the leaders of Russia. But nonetheless, they tried to play by the rules and try to kind of fit in within the world economy as a whole. The NATO and the US, on the other hand, saw Russia's growth as a threat, especially that you got this resurgence of Russian identity, especially after the rise in power of President Vladimir Putin and his war on Chechnya, where he kind of revitalized the Russian army in their attack on Grozny, the capital of the Chechnya province or region or oblast or whatever. And that resurgence of Russian identity, along with the Russian army intervening on this theater, kind of freaked out many nations and kind of brought back a lot of memories around the Soviet kind of sphere of influence. And at the same time, you got this rise in power in China, where China is becoming a powerful world economy and also a powerful nation on the world stage that is also trying to assert itself. So NATO was left with a situation where you got two rivals, well, frenemies of some sorts. They're rivals that are competing for dominance on the world stage, but that we also need to play along with and contain within the wider world system or order. And it realized that it can't compete with both at the same time. So NATO and the US cannot fight or compete or have this rivalry with these two nations at the same time. China by itself is a headache. Russia by itself is maybe a tiny bit lesser headache, but both at the same time are a huge problem. So the only way to proceed forward is to neutralize one of them. Now, China is much harder to neutralize because, well, it's more powerful, has a much larger population, it's harder to invade, and it's also a major contributor to the world economy. So any destabilization of China would destabilize the entire world economy. Russia, on the other hand, is less so. And it's also more prone to containment, so to speak. Now, we got to a situation where NATO made that decision a long time ago, a few years ago. And they started looking at how they could take advantage of the vulnerabilities of Russia in order to do so. And Russia has a major problem. It has a geography problem. Although Russia has many advantages in terms of geography. Again, it's the second largest country in the world. It has so many different resources. It's also a country that has a population of 142 million people, or around 142 million people, which is mostly empty by that standard. And the core of Russia is in its European/Eurasian part, so in the western part of the country. You got around 110 million out of 142 million residing in that core, which in terms of geography is very vulnerable to attacks, or is very exposed in terms of geography. Now, if we talk about the geography of Russia real quick, you got the north, which is, well, the Arctic Circle, which is protected by the Arctic Circle barrier, natural barrier, and is very hard to invade. It's nearly impossible, or actually very disadvantageous, to invade Russia from the north, because you have to navigate very treacherous waters. They're Arctic, they're frozen most of the year. It's very hard to kind of get in from those choke points and invade Russia from the north. So it's kind of protected from the north. In the east, you got the Kamchatka, or I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, the peninsula in the east, and you also got East Siberia, which has rugged terrain and is also protected by natural barriers and provides Russia with an advantageous position. So it's very hard to kind of invade from the east, especially that you got very powerful currents as well in the ocean. And again, Russia has dominance over the Kamchatka, or I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, peninsula, which provides it with control over the Bering Strait and somewhat over the Sea of Japan. So it's kind of very hard to invade. And even if you manage to invade from the east, going all the way from the east and crossing Siberia all the way to the Ural Mountains east of Moscow, or well, in the center, east of the Eurasian core, it is a huge feat that requires massive numbers of troops and a very solid logistical transportation and logistics network, which is not feasible. From the south, it's also vulnerable because you got the Great Central Asian Plains, and you got the steppes, the Central Asian steppes, and you got the you got several deserts in the south that kind of provide some form of shield. You got the Sémhur mountain range, which also provides some form of shield. But there's also a lot of corridors in the south where armies could invade from, which Russia managed to prevent by kind of playing a central role in Central Asian nations, where it kind of sort of sometimes creates conflicts and at other times, well, diffuses those conflicts or mediates those conflicts. So it kind of played a very smart divide and conquer sort of game. And if you notice anything from the Soviet imposed borders of that region, you would notice that the Soviets were always conscious of that threat, and they always wanted to create chaos in that region to kind of prevent any invasion. If you could look at the borders of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, I guess, if I'm not mistaken, they kind of have intertwined borders that are very, very weird, and it created a lot of conflicts in the region, especially due to shortage of water and natural water resources. So they always kept the region in conflict to kind of prevent any power from taking advantage of the geography of the region and invading Russia. Now, this is changing slightly recently because you got China exerting a lot of influence in Central Asia, and you got other NATO countries or Western powers exerting influence in the region. So that is an area of threat to Russia right now, but it's not the immediate area of threat. The immediate area of threat to Russia is to its core to the west. The problem with Russia's geography is the Great European Plain. You got this Great European Plain. If you look at the topography of the European map, you would notice that there's this huge plain that goes from the north of France all the way to the Russian border. And it gets wider as it progresses along. So it starts out very narrowly from the north, of France. And as soon as it reaches the Netherlands, it starts to widen out all the way to the Russian border. And by the time it reaches the Russian border, it's 2,000 kilometers wide, which is practically indefensible. There's no nation on earth that could defend 2,000 kilometers of plains that have no natural barriers. It has hills here and there, but it's mostly flat, which creates a major problem. And in that region, Russia borders a lot of countries, which makes it practically impossible to defend. Any nation, any unified power could roll in across those plains and reach Moscow within hours if traditional weaponry is used. So this is a major threat to Moscow and the Russian core, so Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the rest of the Russian core. And in particular, there are two major strategic points where a unified nation could, in theory, invade Russia and have a major strategic advantage, which are the Baltic states, which Russia needs to control, and east of Ukraine, which Russia also needs to control. So east of Ukraine, you got this gap called the Volgograd Gap, which passes through Volgograd in Russia, the Volgograd area or region of Russia, going all the way from east of Ukraine all the way to the Caspian Sea, which is a sea shared between the different nations of the Caucasus and Russia and Iran. Well, you got Azerbaijan, Russia, and Iran. That sea, that area, that Volgograd Gap, would allow, in theory, any invading power to disconnect Russia from its Caucasus region, so it would effectively lose access or power over or control over its Caucasus region, the Black Sea, and at the same time the Caspian Sea, which is disastrous to Russia. And this Volgograd Gap is a major vulnerability in the geography of Russia that many nations try to take advantage of. You got the Germans trying to cross that gap or cover that gap in both world wars, and Russia is very conscious of that threat. So mainly you got the Volgograd Gap and you got the western end of Russia, or the Russian core, which is, well, the Great European Plain. So anything east of Ukraine and anything east of the East European countries is of a major threat to Russia. What the Soviet Union did back then, and it was conscious of that vulnerability, is that it expanded, and not a lot of people realize that, but the borders of the Soviet Union were deliberately designed to prevent any attack or threat to the Russian core. It was designed in a very specific, meticulous way to kind of prevent any geographic vulnerabilities. What the Soviets did is they pushed westward and they annexed, or at least had these buffer satellite East European states all the way from Poland and Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia now, which was part of the Prussian Empire, the predecessor of the German Empire, which was a German nation, and the Carpathian Mountains in western Ukraine, bordering western Ukraine, and it covered all of that region, and which was called that border between this Soviet region and NATO was called the Iron Curtain back then. And the Soviet Union controlled all of those countries. And it was designed in a way to limit the advantage of any invading power, because if you control the region from Kaliningrad to the Carpathian Mountains, then you narrow that Great European Plain, that corridor, to a mere 600 kilometers. So instead of 2,000 kilometers, you're back to 600 kilometers, which is still hard to defend, but at least kind of provides you with some sort of advantage that would kind of level the playing field. Now, Russia annexed Kaliningrad at the end of World War II. Soon enough, it lost control over its satellite states. At the collapse of the Soviet Union, it lost control over its satellite states, and then it lost control over, effective control over Ukraine as well. What happened is, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was this agreement between President or leader Gorbachev of the Soviet Union and the Americans or NATO to reunify Germany. And Russia or the Soviet Union back then gave its blessings to reunify Germany and Berlin under one German nation under two conditions. One, the Polish border, the modern Polish border, would be accepted by the Germans. So the Poles got territories that were traditionally part of German nations, and they got that as a compensation because the Soviet Union to the east took parts of the Polish territories to the east. So basically, Russia and the Soviet Union took a chunk of Poland, and what they did is they imposed new borders where Poland is pushed by a few kilometers, and Poland took a chunk of Germany or the Prussian Empire. And they forced the Germans to accept that, and at the same time they agreed with the Americans and NATO, and I think it was the Foreign Secretary of State James Baker that made that agreement back then, that NATO would not move an inch further from the German border. So basically, we reunify Germany. It joins whatever NATO or whatever nation is anti-Soviet at the moment, or at the time, sorry. And then the promise is there's no further expansionism for NATO eastwards. That's it. You stop at Germany and you're no longer a threat to the Soviet Union. And that was the agreement back then. What happened is, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO started expanding eastwards, and it continued to expand eastwards, precisely to take advantage of that vulnerability in Russia's geography. Again, they were keeping an eye on Russia and wanted to limit its growth or progress or influence. So NATO soon expanded to Poland. It expanded to the Baltic states. So effectively, Russia lost all influence in Poland and in the Baltic states. And then it started expanding to other parts of Eastern Europe. And there were the European Union started expanding as well. So you got these new Eastern European nations joining the European Union, like Bulgaria, like Hungary, like other nations that were traditionally in the Russian sphere. So you got that sphere of influence, Soviet or Russian sphere of influence receding, and the European sphere of influence or NATO's sphere of influence proceeding. And they started playing a very dangerous game as they started to get closer to Russia's borders. They also started to flirt with a lot of nations that were traditionally hardcore Russian allies, like Belarusia. So there was a lot of flirtation between the European Union and the Belarusian dictator, the regime there. So there was a lot of flirtation around that, which kind of angered Russia even further. There was some flirtation with Moldova. There was the the Yugoslav Balkan Wars. There was this new Albanian alignment with the West. There was this new Kosovar alignment with the West, which kind of ate away at Serbia's influence, which is a staunch Russian ally as well. You got Croatia joining the European Union. So they started eating away at Russia's influence or sphere of influence. And then the one that really angered Russia is the incursions into the Caucasus, where there were these conversations with Georgia and this flirtation with Armenia, and then the flirtation with Ukraine. And that's where Russia really intervened. It had no choice. They started cornering Russia in a situation where it will be neutralized. It will be under the gun of NATO, which will allow NATO to focus on China. Again, this was the entire purpose. So Russia ended up annexing parts of Georgia, mainly the Abkhazia and South Ossetia regions of Georgia a few years ago. I believe that was around 2007 or 2008, the year 2007, 2008. And then it ended up with its first aggression on Ukraine, invading and annexing Crimea or the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 to kind of secure that Volgograd gap that we mentioned earlier. And when Ukraine flirted with the idea of joining the European Union, and then NATO, that's where Russia lost it because, well, again, Ukraine is an entry point that would allow any invading nation to cover that Volgograd gap. So this is why it intervened and went to direct war as an option, because, again, it was unavoidable. So Russia was presented with two options at its door. A, not intervene and allow NATO to enter Ukraine, which would mean the end of Russia. or intervene with an unknown outcome that Russia or the Russian leadership likely presumed would be in their favor. And we all know what happened next. They took the latter decision, and it ended up not as expected by the Russian leadership. We all saw the outcome. The Ukrainian people put up quite a fight heroically, and it's not going well for the Russians. Now, bottom line, as a summary, I don't think the conflict is gonna end anytime soon. At least if it ends officially, it's not gonna end unofficially, because Russia could not lose that war. It would throw everything it has in Ukraine, at NATO, and at the Ukrainian people, because it cannot afford to lose Ukraine. If Ukraine is lost, then that would be the end of Russian influence on the world stage. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm trying to play the devil's advocate here, and I'm trying to be neutral. And again, I'm pro self-determination as a general rule. So I do support the right of Ukrainians to choose whatever they want to do. They're European people. They see themselves within Europe. They want to align to the European Union. I find that as a natural course of things. I find that as a natural choice. But again, if we are to put Russia's concerns into consideration, I don't think Russia would be willing to accept that choice by the Ukrainians. I'm not as optimistic as many who believe the war would end soon, but I can't predict the future, and we'll have to wait and see. And I hope whatever happens, the damage to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people would be as limited as possible. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.